Welcome to my presentation on civil society engagement and public participation in natural resource management in transformation countries. We will also touch upon transboundary conservation and focus quite a bit on biosphere reserves as model regions for sustainable development. And this lecture is part of the module Natural Resource and Ecosystem Management in Transformation Countries of the University for Sustainable Development in Eberswalde. So this is the map of biosphere reserves in Europe. And the idea of these areas being model regions for sustainable development is quite attractive. And this does not only hold true for living in harmony with nature and so forth, but also in respect to how decision-making takes place, how local people are involved in environmental planning and decision-making. And I will start with a few biographical notes about my engagement with this topic in the former Soviet Union countries and the former East Bloc. Coming from Finland, neighboring the Soviet Union, where I grew up, I looked for a biosphere reserve and searched for a biosphere reserve for research in the southwestern tip of Finland. This was the Saaristomeren biosfäärialue. And there was another biosphere reserve in Estonia, the West Estonian Archipelago Biosphere Reserve. And the third one, which was also interesting, the Southeast Rügen Biosphere Reserve. And there I did research. I interviewed a lot of people in the 1990s, short after the independence of Estonia, and also short after Rügen was not anymore part of the German Democratic Republic. So I will come back to this in a minute. Another highlight was a summer school at the border between the Bialoveža Biosphere Reserve and another one on the Belarusian side. So here we have a transboundary situation area where the European bisons are the iconic animals. And in this summer school, which took place in 2013 and 14, we also had as a topic civil society engagement and public participation in the management of these parks. And going further to the east, to the countries Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, we have there done participatory knowledge mapping on how to establish agroforestry system in Central Asia, also former Soviet Union countries. So there's a broad geographical range where these kind of issues have been for interest to me. Okay, let's go back to Estonia. And the late 1980s, the beginning of 1990, the singing revolution is in Estonia, where people actually gather together into big festivals, singing, and this can be really regarded as a social movement, which eventually led to the independence of Estonia. And looking at the Ukraine in 1990s, also big social movements. And in many countries of the Soviet Union, we have sort of the same spirit and a great mobilization of people for fighting for sovereignty. And this time is also characterized by great optimism and the belief in deliberative democracy, that in these countries, decision-making will be more democratic, will be more participatory. Later on, also the internet played an important role. There was great hopes in the internet as a form of empowering people and contributing to democratic decision making. Many of these early optimistic views were then caught by the real life situation where the internet was actually used then for manipulating people and taking control over media. If we look at Ukraine in particular and the aspect of freedom of speech, we see that there are several channels. Many of them are close to certain political parties, but this media landscapes plays an important role in countries of transition. And as we heard in yesterday's lecture, countries of transition basically in this context refer frequently to countries of the East Bloc, which were part of the Soviet Union and then got independent. But as we discussed earlier, actually every country should become a country of transition towards sustainability. But here we will look at the freedom status, and the Freedom House has actually had a look at different countries, to what extent they are can be regarded being not free or partly free or free, and we see that the Ukraine is regarded as partly free, and the free press is one aspect playing an important role in this respect. If we have a look at the change in the Freedom House Freedom Score, we see that actually Ukraine is scoring better, so there is an improvement in terms of freedom score, which has also led, or which is one aspect of it, is the growth of public activism, different NGO taking an active role in societal dialogues and having impact on decision making. So this is also one phenomenon that we can observe in the Ukrainian context. If we go back in time to 1990s and my case study in Hiiumaa, one of the Estonian islands of the Estonian Biosphere Reserve, we see that according to a social survey conducted at that time, Hiiumaa people perceive that they have little possibilities for influencing decision making. And these are some of the results of the interviews I did in that time. And one representative planner said that I think this was the first time people were confronted with this kind of a question. Perhaps they have never thought about it before, so the answer is very likely to be negative. You must know something, have experience, and know the rules of how to act. Then you can have some impact. Or another quote, the people of Hiiumaa regard political and public activities as a very suspicious area. Politicians and civil servants are believed to have sought their positions mainly for personal gain. Now and then, actual examples unfortunately confirm these attitudes. There are many deficiencies in today's Estonia concerning social networks, trust in the state, public institutions, the legal system, and commonly accepted norm systems are not in abundance. This one in the 1990s, and in the meanwhile, Estonia has developed its democratic decision making. Actually, it's one of the countries where you can electronically take part in voting in parliament. So it's one of the fast forward countries in terms of digitalization and using different internet tools for enhancing democracy. And you can ask, how is it in other former Soviet Union countries? Has it changed a lot? Are these the same attitudes that we find there? And we can see some interesting quantitative research results in this respect. I must apologize for the poor quality of this graph, but it shows on the x-axis the percentage agreeing that democracy is a good way to run a country. And we see here post-Soviet Union countries in 1990 to 1993, and here in 2005 and 2014. This survey is done in this period. And we actually see that there is slightly more people who believe that democracy is a good way to run a country. And on the y-axis, we see the percentage with trust in civil society organization. And here, actually, the increase is quite much higher. Here on this corner, we have high support for democracy, high trust in civil society. Unfortunately, we see that in Central Europe, for example, the percentage of people agreeing that democracy is a good way to run the country has slightly decreased, according to this research. Okay, and other quantitative research results by Meyer et al., recent ones, perceive the influence of institutional forces in government-dominated context. So East European countries, and we see here the perceived influence of actors on civil society. The central government is quite high, but here we have the direction of perceived influence, which is slightly on the negative side. And here on the high upper corner, we have foreign donors, private philanthropists, and so forth. An interesting paper that I can recommend, and one of the conclusions of this paper is actually, while looking at countries which are government dominated, such as here, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. Then there are other countries which are rather foreign dominated context and then mixed context. And the conclusion is that there is no such thing as a typical former Soviet Union country, because the context is very different and the institutional forces and the perception about institutional forces is very diverse from country to country. And indeed, each of the so-called transformation countries have to be seen in the context of their historical developments if we try to understand how civil society works at the moment and how civil society engagement looks in practice. All right, so these countries I'm talking about, Ukraine, Estonia, Germany, Finland, and so forth, have signed a convention which is pretty important in this context. It is the Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. This convention has been signed by the countries that you see here on the map and on the internet page, which you can see here below. You can also see the dates of ratification of this convention. Ukraine ratified this in the end of 1999. So this is one argument why in natural resources management, public participation should take place in a routine way and not be something added on the top in an experimental way. Why should stakeholders play a role in natural resource management? The Aarhus Convention is one legal document, one binding legal document, which requires it, but there are other good reasons for stakeholder engagement. Increasingly, stakeholders expect that they can have a say in issues that affect their lives. So this is the fairness argument. Second argument is that it can improve the quality of decision making. It increases the competence. Also, when we look at representative democracy, deliberative processes, public participation can be used to enhance these kind of decision making, making in the end better decisions, increasing the quality. And the third argument is effectiveness. When stakeholders have been engaged from the early phases in setting the scope of alternatives, framing a problem or an issue in natural resources management, they are much more likely to play an active role in the implementation of these decisions. So the ownership question is important in this context. Here you see some pictures from our Ukraine excursions from past years, where we are meeting the mayors of different municipalities in the Carpathian Biosphere Reserve. In my early studies in the 3 biosphere reserves in Finland, Estonia, and Germany, former GDR, I had a look at 2 aspects of natural resources management: public participation and the aspect of integration. Integration meaning that issues related to forestry, mining, agriculture, nature conservation, and so forth should not be treated separately, but rather in an integrated way instead of having a sectoral approach. And instead of excluding people from participating in decision making, people should be engaged in different ways. And well, on the lower left corner, we find routine management, which in times in the early 1990s, for example, in the West Estonian Biosphere Reserve, was sort of the dominating planning style. However, the Biosphere Reserve contributed with new ideas, trying to develop management and planning into direction of more participation and integration. Sector-based participatory management was typical for the German case, where the different agencies worked quite closely together, but the people felt that there is little participation. In the Finnish case, the sector-based participatory management was the style in the Finnish case, and social engineering being very integrated, but excluding people, sort of the dominating management style in the German case. And the aim was to do something which can be called as management as mutual learning, and how we can actually move planning and management into this direction. This is the issue when we talk about public participation and stakeholder dialogues. Sarkki and his co-authors have identified 3 different types of governance, a bit in a similar style, in the Ukraine, where we find more hierarchical governance, participatory governance, and self-governance, where actually we have then local initiatives and policy in experiments, where we have power of local actors in engaging in forestry management, or in the hierarchical governance approach, where we have a single authority playing an important role, and the more a technocracy of state and experts. Also readings that I can recommend, and the source is visible at the end of my presentation. 4 modes of participatory governance inspired by Einstein's ladder of citizen participation, where we find like technical decision making to include local stakeholders, more instrumental approach or an informative approach, where local inputs are asked for informing decisions, or where local people are formally connected, and then actually discussions ensuring tangible flows of ecosystem services for local stakeholders. So where we find the lower end democratic forest governance, in contrast to something that we can call authoritative forest governance. So in our exercises that we have done in the context of summer schools or research projects in Central Asia, we try to bring together local knowledge and scientific knowledge, also to formalize local people's knowledge and visualizing knowledge, trying to make it more explicit. And it's in such efforts, actually, biosphere reserves can play an active role, contributing to stakeholder dialogues. And if we look at the role of biosphere reserve in my case studies in Estonia, Germany, and Finland, there were sort of more visible and less visible roles on Rügen, for example, no-sayer in building submissions. In Archipelago C in Finland, it was a more discursive facilitator, but seeking also a role on Hiiumaa, contributing to the debates and educating local people. And then there were also some less visible roles. For example, on the case of Rügen, promoting the concept of whole island being a Rügen model region. I argue that biosphere reserve administration can act as a parallel learning organization. And what does it mean? A parallel learning organization would be an actor which works closely with different sectoral agencies such as forestry, agricultural extension, mining, tourism, etc., and also tries to involve different civil society actors into planning and management. It's like a facilitator. And to some extent, we can find this role in very many biosphere reserves. And of course, there are challenges which these biosphere reserves face. The compatibility of the stakeholder approach with the existing institutions and the style of governance, which, as we said, is very diverse from country to country, and local traditions and local culture. The willingness to cooperate of local partners is also a crucial issue. And in some cases, we find a few organized interest groups like NGOs, which makes it difficult to engage local people or stakeholders in decision making. In some cases, you can find that there is seasonal absence. People living abroad, working abroad, and coming back only for certain periods of time. All these challenges we have faced in our experiences in countries in transition. So biosphere reserves and biosphere reserves administration can act as a catalyst, actually trying to move the concept of a transition country, broaden it to a transition to sustainability. And as we said, all countries in the world should be countries in transition. Biosphere reserves have a mandate to do it as parallel learning organization and to contribute to improved integration of sustainability in planning, land use planning, natural resources management, infrastructure planning, etc. Here are some of the sources that you can that I would like to refer to and which I recommend as readings. And I would like to thank you, Meric, for your attention. And I would like to close with the picture from the core zone in the Carpathian Biosphere Reserve. Thank you very much for your attention.